My parents did not invite me to Thanksgiving this year. When I asked my mother why my name was left off the family dinner reservation, she did not hesitate before breaking my heart. She told me that my brother Julian was bringing his new high-profile girlfriend to meet the family for the first time, and Julian did not want me anywhere near the table because my own blue-collar job would embarrass him in front of her. My mother said my presence would completely ruin the perfect corporate image my brother had spent years building for his relationship. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I did not beg for an invitation. I just said quietly, "I understand." 5 days later, they showed up at my door absolutely furious after finding out the truth. My brother's highly wealthy elite girlfriend was not who they thought she was. Before I reveal the massive secret that turned my family's perfect holiday into an absolute corporate nightmare, let me know where you are watching this video from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you have ever been underestimated, excluded, or cast aside by a toxic family who valued social status over true unconditional love, this emotional journey is for anyone who has ever had to stand completely firm in their own personal worth when the very people who raised them treated them like a total embarrassment without any valid human reason. My name is Maya. I am 33 years old, and I have spent the last decade learning how to survive in the spaces my family claimed I was not good enough to occupy. At the exact moment my phone buzzed with the group chat notification that shattered my family relations forever, I was standing in heavy steel-toed safety boots, a mud-splattered high-visibility vest, and a hard hat at a massive industrial development site on the edge of the city. The cold November wind was running grit across the lot, and the deep rumble of diesel engines filled the air as a fleet of specialized commercial eco-processing trucks moved massive loads of organic waste behind me. To my parents and my brother, this was a filthy, shameful landscape. To them, I was just a low-level worker who hauled junk and spent her days covered in literal garbage. They had no idea that this entire 3-acre industrial facility, along with every single multi-ton processing machine operating on it, belonged entirely to me. I had built this enterprise brick by brick after they abandoned me to fund Julian's life. While my family fussed over his corporate titles, I worked 60-hour weeks in silence learning municipal codes, zoning laws, and tax variances. I poured every cent from my small savings into local land development contracts, slowly creating a highly profitable ecological processing system that redefined urban waste management across the entire state without their knowledge. I pulled my rugged industrial tablet from my vest pocket to check the incoming notifications. The family group chat was lighting up with rapid-fire messages. My mother, Susan, had posted a sleek digital mock-up of the seating chart for their upscale Thanksgiving dinner at a premium restaurant downtown. Every single aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend had an assigned seat at the long linen-draped table. My name was completely missing. When I sent a direct message asking if there had been a technical glitch with the digital invitation, my mother did not take the conversation to a private layout. She responded directly in the main family group chat for everyone to see. She typed out that accommodations were extremely tight this year, and that because Julian was introducing his new partner, they needed to curate a specific, elegant atmosphere. She bluntly stated that my daily line of work simply did not align with the sophisticated background of the guests Julian was trying to impress. This public humiliation was an intentional, calculated strategy to erase me from the family landscape entirely. For 20 years, Susan had specialized in making me feel invisible while elevating Julian's ordinary life. Every major holiday was an interrogation about my financial failures or a lecture about my lack of corporate prestige. They preferred the comfortable lie of my mediocrity over the complex reality of my independent success because it protected Julian's fragile ego. His constant need for parental validation always dictated our family dynamic. Before I could even process the cold mechanical cruelty of my mother's message, my brother Julian jumped into the chat to deliver the final blow. Julian was 35, the undisputed golden child, and a newly appointed vice president at a mid-sized investment firm. He lived his life entirely for appearances, driving luxury cars he could barely afford. Julian texted the entire family circle, saying, "Don't take it personally, Maya." but she comes from a highly educated, wealthy African-American family in New York with massive corporate connections. I am currently positioning myself for a major partnership at my firm, and I absolutely cannot risk my sister showing up smelling like landfill garbage and talking about blue-collar junk hauling in front of her. Our father immediately liked Julian's message, adding that the family needed to focus all resources on Julian's big career milestone. I did not type out a long defense. I simply responded, "I understand. Happy Thanksgiving." I locked the screen, sliding the tablet away. I turned away from the phone and looked at the elegant, sharp-suited African-American woman standing next to me amidst the heavy eco-machinery. I said, "Sorry about that interruption, Zoe. The facility upgrade report is completely finalized and ready for your review." Zoe, my brother, Julian's supposed wealthy new girlfriend, just smiled professionally at me, completely unaware of the text messages. She tapped her screen and said, "Perfect, Maya, let us sign the multi-million-dollar partnership deal right now." 3 days before that group chat message officially severed my ties to the family, the stage was already being set for their absolute downfall. It was a chaotic Monday afternoon at the TerraCycle main processing plant. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and crushed concrete. I was standing near the primary sorting bay, going over load manifests with my floor manager, when the aggressive roar of a finely tuned sports car engine cut through the heavy industrial noise. A silver Maserati violently swerved past the commercial vehicle checkpoint, kicking up a cloud of dirt. It sped right past the authorized personnel-only signs and slammed to a halt inches from a towering pile of sorted scrap metal. The driver's side door swung open, and my older brother Julian stepped out onto the muddy pavement. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit completely out of place against the backdrop of excavators and dump trucks. He immediately looked down at his polished leather loafers with a look of pure disgust, kicking at a clump of wet dirt. My father David slowly emerged from the passenger side, pulling his cashmere coat tight against the wind. He pinched his nose, waving his hand in front of his face, as if the very air around my business was a personal insult to his existence. I handed my clipboard to my floor manager and walked over to them. I wiped heavy grease from my hands onto my denim work pants. I did not get a hello. Julian looked me up and down with absolute contempt. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his heavy silver key fob, and tossed it directly into the mud, at my steel-toed boots. "Have one of your trash sorters detail this car before 5 o'clock tonight," Julian demanded, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Make sure they use microfiber towels. I cannot have any scratches on the clear coat. I have a massive date tonight with a senior partner from Vanguard Venture Capital, and I need the interior smelling like leather, not like toxic waste." I stared down at the keys sinking into the wet mud. I kept my voice perfectly level. "Julian, this is an active industrial processing site. It is not a luxury car wash. We process thousands of tons of commercial eco-waste here daily. You cannot just demand my crew stop their operations to scrub your tires." My father stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Do not use that disrespectful tone with your brother Maya. Julian is making senior partner at his investment firm next month. He is dealing with high-level executives and massive portfolios. Try not to ruin his expensive tires with your toxic garbage. We are relying entirely on his corporate success for our retirement funding, and the least you can do is support him when you contribute absolutely nothing else of value to this family name." The sheer audacity of his statement hung in the cold air. My father was looking at a daughter who commanded a $50 million industrial empire, yet he only saw a failure who played in the dirt. He had convinced himself that Julian was the sole financial savior of the family. "You want me to wash his car so he can impress a venture capitalist?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Julian laughed, a sharp, arrogant sound that echoed off the metal shipping containers. "I do not want you to wash it, Maya. I want you to pay one of your minimum wage junk haulers to wash it. I have a critical networking dinner, and this Vanguard partner is a highly educated, sophisticated woman. She manages 9-figure funds. I cannot show up looking like I associate with garbage handlers. Just get the car clean. I will text you the address of the restaurant so you can drop it off to the valet by 6. Do not come inside." Julian reached into his breast pocket to pull out his phone, and as he did, a thick, glossy business card slipped out and fluttered down into the dirt next to his keys. He did not even notice. He turned his back on me completely and flagged down the premium black car rideshare he had apparently ordered to take them back to the financial district. My father gave me one last look of intense disappointment. "Wash your hands before you touch his steering wheel, Maya," he ordered sharply. He then turned and followed Julian into the back of the waiting luxury vehicle. I stood alone in the noise of the sorting yard and watched the black car speed away through the industrial gates. I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply bent down and picked up the muddy Maserati keys. Then I picked up the glossy business card Julian had dropped. I wiped the grime off the thick cardstock with my thumb and read the embossed silver lettering. Zoe Carter, Senior Fraud Auditor and Acquisition Partner, Vanguard Venture Capital. A slow, cold realization washed over me. Julian had no idea who he was actually trying to romance. He thought he was dating a wealthy, naive executive who could elevate his social status. He did not know that Zoe Carter was the exact same woman who had spent the last 6 months aggressively negotiating a massive commercial partnership with my company. TerraCycle was Vanguard's biggest environmental investment target of the decade. She knew exactly who I was, and she knew exactly how much power I held. More importantly, if Zoe was auditing Julian's investment firm, it meant Vanguard was planning a hostile takeover. Julian was essentially bragging about dating the woman who was actively investigating his financial records. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed a direct private number. The line rang twice before my lead corporate attorney answered. "Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of the grinding machinery. "I need you to pull the complete financial portfolio on Julian's investment firm immediately. Run a deep background trace on his client accounts and cross-reference them with my parents' current mortgage statements. Vanguard Venture Capital is currently auditing his firm, and I want to know exactly what they are about to find before they execute their takeover." I paused, looking at the silver Maserati parked illegally on my dirt lot. Then I added one final instruction. "And Marcus, prepare the legal paperwork for a majority stake acquisition. If Julian's firm is going under, I want to be the one who owns the wreckage." Thursday afternoon arrived with a quiet stillness that settled over the entire downtown financial district. I sat at the head of a massive reclaimed wood conference table inside my glass-walled penthouse office on the 20th floor. The panoramic view of the skyline was breathtaking, but my focus remained entirely on the thick stack of legal documents resting in front of me. While millions of families across the country gathered around crowded dining tables to carve turkeys and share warm traditions, my holiday meal consisted of a simple container of takeout pad thai. I ate my meal very quietly, deeply savoring the perfect solitude of the massive, empty corporate headquarters. There were no insults here. There was no one telling me to wash my hands or hide my boots. There was only the quiet hum of the climate control system and the undeniable weight of absolute power resting right at my fingertips. I wiped my mouth with a paper napkin and picked up my favorite gold-plated fountain pen. I flipped open the top folder, tracing the heavy black text printed across the cover page. It read, "Vanguard, TerraCycle merger, and hostile acquisition." Zoe had moved incredibly fast. Her legal team at Vanguard Venture Capital had spent the last 3 days working alongside Marcus and my own corporate attorneys to completely dismantle Julian's investment firm on paper. We had quietly bought up their debt, leveraged their vulnerable assets, and positioned TerraCycle to execute a ruthless majority stake takeover. I flipped to the signature line at the bottom of the 60-page contract. I did not feel an ounce of guilt as the ink flowed onto the page. I was simply cleaning up toxic waste, which was exactly the job my family always said I was meant to do. I pushed the signed document aside and tapped the screen of my tablet to check the time. It was exactly 4 in the afternoon. Right on cue, a notification popped up on my personal social media feed. My mother had just gone live on her profile. I clicked the video, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair to watch the absolute circus unfolding across town. Susan was holding her phone high in the air, panning across a ridiculously lavish dining room table that looked like it belonged in a royal palace rather than their mortgaged suburban home. They had clearly gone into massive credit card debt just to fund this single evening. The table was practically groaning under the weight of imported French wines, artisanal cheeses, and a massive centerpiece of exotic flowers that easily cost over $1,000. My father stood in this background wearing a brand new tailored suit, pouring an expensive vintage champagne into crystal flutes. They were trying so desperately to project an image of generational wealth to impress a woman they believed held the key to Julian's elite social elevation. The camera panned over to Julian, who was smiling widely, his arm draped possessively around Zoe's chair. Zoe looked absolutely stunning in a sleek designer dress holding her champagne glass with perfect posture. She caught the camera lens and offered a polite, totally unreadable smile to the viewers. She was playing her part flawlessly. She was sitting in the lion's den, eating their imported caviar, knowing full well she had just handed me the legal authority to completely destroy their financial existence. My mother turned the camera back to her own face, her smile stretching so wide it looked painful. She adjusted her diamond necklace and practically shouted into the microphone. "We are just so incredibly blessed this year. I am so glad to have our highly successful son and his beautiful, sophisticated partner sitting at our table today. It is truly a gathering of minds." She paused, letting a performative theatrical sigh escape her lips. Our other daughter could not make it today, unfortunately. She is out of state doing manual labor. We are just hoping she stays warm out there in the elements. But anyway, happy Thanksgiving from our elite little circle to yours. I stared at the screen as the live video ended, and the image froze on my mother's smug, condescending face. She could not resist taking one final public shot at my expense. She genuinely wanted her hundreds of online followers to believe I was out in the freezing cold, hauling garbage bags with my bare hands too poor and uneducated to sit at her pristine holiday table. She wanted absolutely everyone to know that Julian was the sole source of pride in her entire life. I did not leave an angry comment. I did not text her to defend my honor. I simply closed the application, picked up my heavy brass corporate stamp, and pressed it firmly down onto the final page of the Vanguard TerraCycle merger document. The loud, satisfying thud echoed through the empty penthouse. The deal was officially executed. Julian no longer worked for a prestigious investment firm. Julian worked for me. I packed up my briefcase, turned off the office lights, and went home to enjoy a long, peaceful, uninterrupted weekend of absolute silence. That silence lasted exactly until Monday morning. I was standing in my kitchen at 7 pouring a fresh cup of coffee when my phone vibrated so violently it nearly rattled right off the marble countertop. I picked it up and looked at the glowing screen. The notification panel was completely overwhelmed. There were exactly 47 missed calls from my mother, all logged within the last 15 minutes. Before I could even swipe my thumb to open the call log, a text message from Julian blasted across the screen in all capital letters. It was a frantic, profanity-laced message that radiated pure, unadulterated panic. "What on earth did you do to my accounts?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee. The storm had finally hit the coast, and they had absolutely nowhere to run. I ignored the 47 missed calls and turned my phone completely off. Let them panic. Let Julian sweat through his expensive custom Italian suits. I had a hostile corporate takeover to finalize, and I needed an absolutely clear head to process the massive victory I had just secured. By Tuesday morning, the financial markets had opened to the shocking news of the Vanguard TerraCycle merger. I was sitting behind my expansive mahogany desk on the 20th floor of the TerraCycle corporate tower. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a pristine, unobstructed view of the financial district, but my attention was locked squarely on the digital reports glowing across my dual monitors. Julian's mid-sized investment firm was currently bleeding out on paper. Zoe and her legal team at Vanguard had effectively frozen all of their assets, pending a massive federal audit of their terribly mismanaged client funds. My hostile acquisition was fully underway. I was just reviewing the final asset transfer documents when the heavy oak doors of my office were violently thrown wide open. The crash rattled the glass partitions of the adjacent conference room. Two of my uniformed corporate security guards were actively trying to physically restrain three very familiar, completely enraged people. Julian, my father, and my mother stormed past the security checkpoint, their faces twisted with pure, unadulterated fury. Even standing in the absolute center of a meticulously designed multi-million-dollar executive suite, my family was completely blinded by their own arrogant assumptions. They had spent decades treating me like dirt, and their brains simply could not process the reality of their surroundings. To them, I was still just the blue-collar disappointment. They genuinely believed I had simply snuck into an empty executive office while I was supposed to be emptying the trash cans or polishing the hardwood floors. Julian looked like he had not slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his expensive silk tie hung loosely around his neck. He marched right up to my desk and slammed his fist down against the polished wood so hard that my coffee cup rattled in its saucer. "You sabotaged me!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You found out who Zoe was and you poisoned her against me out of pure jealousy. My company accounts were frozen this morning." Before I could even formulate a response to his frantic accusations, my mother forcefully shoved past one of the security guards who was reaching for his shoulder radio. "How could you drag your brother down just because you're a miserable junk hauler?" Susan shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger directly at my face. He was about to make senior partner at his firm. He was about to secure our family retirement. And you ruined it because you could not stand to see him succeed while you wallow in garbage for a living. You are a spiteful, vindictive girl. My father, David, quickly stepped up right beside her, his face red with indignation. He looked around the massive office, taking in the expensive modern art on the walls and the custom leather furniture, and he actually scowled at me. "Get out of that executive chair before you get fired and arrested for trespassing, Maya," my father demanded sharply. "You are already in enough legal trouble. I am calling your building supervisor right now. I am going to make sure you never scrub another floor or haul another bag of trash in this entire city." You used your low-level janitorial access to stalk Julian's girlfriend and spread malicious lies about him to her firm. The sheer breathtaking delusion of their accusations was almost physically painful. They honestly thought I had somehow cornered a high-powered venture capitalist while mopping a hallway and convinced her to freeze a massive investment fund just to ruin a family Thanksgiving dinner. Julian was pacing frantically back and forth across my woven office rug, breathing heavily and running his hands through his messy hair. "Zoe will not even return my calls," Julian shouted, panic bleeding through his aggressive tone. "The Vanguard compliance officers locked our building at dawn. My corporate credit cards were declined at the valet stand downstairs. I am completely locked out of my own life, Maya. You need to fix this right now. You are going to call Zoe, apologize for whatever trashy lies you told her, and beg her to reverse the audit. Then you are going to empty whatever pathetic savings account you have to help me float a legal defense fund because I am currently completely broke." I remained completely seated, my hands resting calmly flat on the smooth mahogany surface of my desk. I looked at the three people who had spent my entire life making sure I felt entirely invisible and worthless. They were currently standing in the headquarters of a $50 million enterprise that I had built from the ground up, demanding that I hand over my money to save the golden child from his own incompetence. They were so desperate to maintain their false narrative of superiority that they could not see the massive corporate axe hanging directly over their heads. One of the security guards, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Marcus, stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Julian's shoulder. "Ma'am," the guard said, looking directly at me with professional concern. "Should we call the police and have them escorted off the premises for trespassing?" Julian scoffed loudly, attempting to shake off the guard's heavy grip. "Do not bother listening to her." Julian sneered at the guard. "She does not have the authority to call the police. She just cleans the toilets here. I want to speak to the actual CEO of this company immediately. I am going to have her fired." I looked at my brother's arrogant red face, and then I looked at my parents who were nodding in fierce agreement with his demands. I calmly waved the security guards away, signaling them to release Julian's shoulder. I reached out and pressed the silver intercom button resting on the edge of my massive mahogany desk. Helen, hold my 10 o'clock calls, I said, my voice projecting clearly through the speaker and echoing into the silent room. My family just realized who owns this building. The silence that followed my intercom announcement was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that completely consumed the massive executive suite. The only sound left in the room was the faint hum of the city traffic 20 stories below. I watched my mother slowly lower her accusatory finger. Her mouth hung slightly open, her eyes darting frantically between my face, the sleek silver intercom unit, and the incredibly expensive original artwork lining the walls. She was desperately trying to make the pieces of a puzzle fit into a picture she fundamentally refused to accept. My father stared at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. Julian just stood there, his chest heaving, his brain short-circuiting, as his deeply ingrained superiority complex violently clashed with undeniable reality. They still could not grasp it. They needed tangible proof. I calmly pushed my chair back and stood up to my full height. I walked around the side of my massive mahogany desk, my heavy work boots thudding softly against the imported rug. I reached into my locked file drawer and pulled out a thick leather-bound portfolio. I tossed it directly into the center of the desk. The heavy thud made all three of them jump. "Read it, Julian," I commanded, my voice projecting undeniable authority. Julian hesitated, glancing at our parents before tentatively reaching out. He flipped open the heavy cover. Inside sat the finalized state-certified incorporation documents for TerraCycle Eco Industrial. Right at the top, printed in bold, undeniable ink, was my name listed as the sole founder and chief executive officer. "I do not haul trash for an hourly wage," I explained, looking directly into my brother's panicked eyes. "I own the trucks. I own the processing plants. I own the multi-acre industrial sites. I hold the exclusive municipal contracts for urban waste management across 3 different state districts. You are currently standing in the corporate headquarters of a $50 million commercial empire that I built entirely from the ground up while you were busy trying to lease cars. You could not afford to impress people who do not actually care about you." My father snatched the paperwork out of Julian's hands. His eyes rapidly scanned the legal jargon, his face draining of all color. He shook his head violently, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the heavy parchment. "This is a complete lie," David stammered, his voice rising in panicked denial. "This is some kind of elaborate fabrication. You could not possibly own a company like this. You are a college dropout. You are a failure. You have always been a failure. You do not have the education or the pedigree to run a $50 million corporation." The sheer cruelty of his words, even when faced with undeniable proof of my success, ignited a fire in my chest. Decades of suppression, gaslighting, and emotional manipulation finally boiled over. "I did not drop out of college, Dad," I snapped back, stepping closer to him until he was forced to look me directly in the eyes. "I was expelled, and we all know exactly why." My mother gasped, taking a sudden step backward, as if I had physically struck her. Susan knew exactly what I was talking about. "I was expelled because my tuition account was completely drained." I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "I was expelled because someone forged my signature on withdrawal slips and stole my entire senior year tuition to cover a massive, humiliating stock market margin call." I turned my fierce glare toward Julian, who immediately looked down at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. "Julian stole my future to cover his own pathetic gambling mistakes," I stated clearly, laying the long-buried truth out in the open air. "He committed felony fraud. I was pulled out of my classes and interrogated by the university financial office. And when I came to you both crying and terrified, what did you do? You begged me to swallow it. You told me that Julian was destined for greatness, that a criminal record would ruin his pristine corporate trajectory. You forced me to take the fall. You forced me to pack my bags, leave my degree behind, and move into a rundown apartment so your golden boy could keep his flawless reputation. You called me a failure for 20 years to cover up his crime." The heavy truth paralyzed them. My father looked away, his jaw tight. My mother pressed her hand over her mouth, tears of shame finally welling in her eyes. They had built their entire parental identity on Julian's success, completely ignoring the fact that his foundation was built on my stolen future. I had spent the last decade working 60-hour weeks in freezing mud and sweltering heat, fighting for every single contract, mastering complex environmental codes, and building a fortress of wealth that they could never touch. Julian, desperate to escape the crushing weight of his own exposed guilt, let out a harsh, nervous laugh. He threw the incorporation papers back onto my desk, frantically trying to regain his sense of superiority. "So what?" Julian sneered, his voice shaking with false bravado. "You run a glorified dumpster company. You are the queen of the garbage heap. Congratulations, Maya. But that means absolutely nothing to me right now. A waste management business does not give you the power to freeze institutional investment funds. That does not explain why Zoe Carter and the Vanguard compliance team just locked my entire company out of our own accounts this morning. You are just a junk hauler. You do not have the authority to trigger a federal audit on my firm." Julian crossed his arms over his chest, his face red and sweating desperately, clinging to his last shred of corporate arrogance. He firmly believed I was still beneath him, still incapable of orchestrating his downfall. The heavy oak doors of my office suddenly swung open again, the brass handles clicking sharply. The crisp, authoritative sound of designer heels echoed across the hardwood floor. "I can explain that," a sharp, elegant voice announced. Julian spun around, his arrogant expression instantly dissolving into pure terror. My parents froze, completely bewildered by the sudden intrusion. Zoe stepped into the center of the room. She was wearing a stunning, tailored burgundy suit, holding a sleek leather portfolio under her arm. She did not look like a woman showing up for a romantic Thanksgiving dinner. She looked like a corporate executioner. Zoe walked straight past my trembling brother, completely ignoring his existence, and came to stand directly by my side. She placed her portfolio on my mahogany desk and offered me a warm, genuine smile of professional solidarity. Julian immediately softened his posture desperately, attempting to smooth out his rumpled suit jacket and plastering on the charming, practiced smile he reserved exclusively for high society networking events. He reached his hand out toward her, stepping aggressively into her personal space, as if he could physically pull her out of the reality unfolding around them. "Zoe, baby, what are you doing here?" Julian chuckled, though his voice wavered with unmistakable panic. "You do not need to be involved in this pathetic family drama. Let us get out of this dump and go get lunch at the club. I can explain everything over drinks." Zoe did not even blink. She completely ignored his outstretched hand and took a deliberate step closer to my chair, cementing her position squarely on my side of the battlefield. She turned her icy, perfectly composed gaze toward my parents, who were currently staring at her, as if she were an apparition. "Julian spent our entire Thanksgiving dinner telling me that his sister was a massive social liability," Zoe stated, her voice echoing with crystal-clear authority across the silent office. "He spent hours bragging about his own financial genius, while assuring me that you, Maya, were nothing but an uneducated janitor who would only drag down his elite reputation. He was incredibly thorough in his character assassination." My mother shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between my designer suit and Zoe's authoritative stance. She tried to force a polite, accommodating smile, clearly still hoping to salvage her son's relationship with a woman she perceived as his ticket to upper-class royalty. "Well, Zoe dear," Susan stammered, her hands fluttering nervously in front of her chest. "You know how siblings can exaggerate. Julian is just very protective of his professional image. We all are. But surely you can see that Maya is simply acting out because she is jealous of your relationship with him. You two make such a beautiful couple." Zoe let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut right through my mother's desperate pleasantries. "Your son is a complete fool," Zoe replied, looking directly into my mother's eyes. "He spent the last 6 months aggressively pursuing me because he believed I was just a naive venture capital partner with a massive trust fund. He wanted access to Vanguard's capital. What Julian failed to realize during his pathetic attempts to charm me is that TerraCycle Eco-Industrial is actually Vanguard's single biggest client. I have known Maya for 3 years. We built the Series B funding model for this exact corporate headquarters together. She is one of the most brilliant business minds I have ever had the privilege of working alongside." The absolute shock on my father's face was palpable. He looked at me, then at Zoe, and finally at Julian, his meticulously constructed illusion of his golden boy finally beginning to crack under the weight of reality. "But you two are dating!" Susan cried out, her voice pitching into a frantic, confused whine. "You came to our house for the holidays, you sat at our table, you told us you were looking forward to a future together." Zoe shook her head coldly, her expression shifting from professional detachment to absolute predatory focus. "I do not date mid-level brokers," Zoe stated, her voice dropping to a dangerous, uncompromising register. "I investigate them. I am the lead fraud auditor for Vanguard 5C. Zoe reached out and picked up the heavy portfolio she had placed on my desk. She unzipped it and pulled out a thick, bright red folder. She slammed it down onto the mahogany surface right next to my incorporation papers. The loud smack made Julian physically jump. That folder contains 6 months of meticulous, undeniable forensic accounting. Zoe continued tapping her manicured fingernail against the red cardboard. When Julian's firm approached Vanguard for a capital injection last spring, my team was assigned to run the standard background compliance checks. We immediately found massive irregularities in his personal trading accounts. Your golden boy did not just steal his sister's college tuition to cover his gambling debts a decade ago. He never stopped gambling. When the market turned against him this year, he started quietly siphoning money from his firm's largest institutional clients to cover his massive margin calls. My father stumbled backward, his back hitting the glass partition. The color completely drained from his face as he stared at his son. David was a man who worshipped success and status above all else, and he was currently watching his only source of pride transform into a catastrophic liability. "Julian, tell me she is lying," David demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "Tell me you did not steal from your clients. Tell me you are not going to federal prison." Julian could not speak. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. He looked at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The arrogant, untouchable golden child was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered criminal who finally realized he had run out of places to hide. "He cooked his books, Maya," Zoe said, turning to look at me. "He completely fabricated quarterly return statements to keep his clients docile while he drained their accounts. He stole over $4 million in the last 8 months alone. I spent the entire Thanksgiving dinner sitting in your parents' dining room, gathering the final pieces of verbal evidence I needed to lock down the federal indictment. When he bragged about his upcoming promotions and his untouchable status, he was literally providing me with recorded admissions of his fraudulent intent." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, absorbing the sheer magnitude of Julian's destruction. He had not just ruined his career, he had obliterated his entire life, and my parents, who had willingly sacrificed my future to protect him, were now permanently tethered to his disgrace. "The federal authorities are currently raiding his corporate offices across town," Zoe announced, looking back at my parents with absolute zero sympathy. "They are seizing his servers, freezing his personal bank accounts, and preparing to formally indict him on 22 counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. He is looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary." My mother let out a loud, piercing sob and collapsed into one of the plush guest chairs. She buried her face in her hands, crying hysterically as the reality of her son's impending incarceration washed over her. All of her bragging, all of her condescension, all of her desperate attempts to project an image of generational wealth had just been publicly incinerated. Her social circle would feast on this scandal for years. "You set me up!" Julian suddenly screamed, lunging toward the desk. "You set me up, Maya! You used your billionaire friends to destroy me." Zoe picked up a specific ledger and locked her icy gaze on my mother. Susan shrank back as if the piece of paper were a loaded weapon. "It also funded your lifestyle, Susan," Zoe said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "That lavish Thanksgiving dinner you hosted, the imported caviar, the vintage French champagne, the exotic floral centerpieces, that was all paid for with stolen retirement funds. The recent renovations to your suburban home were financed through a shell company Julian set up using a defrauded client's social security number. You have been living like royalty on the backs of senior citizens who are now completely bankrupt." The color drained entirely from my mother's face. Her knees buckled and my father had to catch her by the waist to keep her from collapsing onto the floor. The performative arrogance they had carried into my office was completely obliterated. They were not just the parents of a successful broker anymore. They were the direct beneficiaries of a massive federal crime. The government would be seizing their house, their cars, and every single luxury item Julian had ever gifted them. Julian went completely pale. He grabbed the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning white. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for a magical escape hatch. His carefully constructed facade of superiority was melting right off his bones. "It is a clerical error," Julian stuttered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "It is just a simple misallocation of funds. My accountants made a mistake with the routing numbers. I was going to put the money back. I just needed one good quarter to leverage the returns and replace the principal capital. You cannot send me to prison for a temporary liquidity issue." Zoe did not even blink at his desperate, transparent lies. "You do not accidentally misallocate $3 million into a private offshore account to buy Italian sports cars," Julian Zoe replied flatly. "You are going to a federal penitentiary and your assets are going to be liquidated at public auction." My father suddenly snapped. The fragile illusion of his perfect family was shattering into a million sharp pieces, and his brain simply refused to process the reality of his golden boy's absolute depravity. David could not blame his son. He had spent his entire life worshipping Julian, so his frantic, desperate mind immediately locked onto the only target he had ever known how to attack. David lunged forward, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "You set him up!" My father roared, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "You used your corporate connections to frame your brother because you have always hated him. You run this massive company and you managed to manipulate the system to hack into his accounts and move that money to frame him. You are trying to destroy our family out of pure vindictive spite." I stared at the man who had raised me, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no desire to scream back. He was a pathetic, delusional man clinging to a sinking ship. He was willing to invent an insane corporate espionage conspiracy rather than admit his son was a common thief. I did not even have to open my mouth to defend myself. Zoe stepped squarely between my father and my desk, her posture radiating absolute authority. She looked at David with pure pity. It was the kind of look one gives to a confused, wounded animal that does not realize the fight is already over. "Maya did not frame him," Zoe said, her voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "Maya is the one who flagged the anomaly to save your family from federal prison." My father's mouth fell open. He froze mid-step, his arm dropping slowly to his side as Zoe's words struck him like physical blows. When Vanguard's algorithms first detected the massive irregularities in Julian's firm, the federal mandate required us to immediately freeze all connected assets. Zoe explained, her tone completely merciless. "That includes the accounts of any family members who receive suspicious financial gifts." Maya stepped in and leveraged her own corporate portfolio to stall the asset seizure on your personal home. She bought you exactly 48 hours to hire legal counsel before the Department of Justice seizes everything you own. David looked at me, his eyes wide with a horrified, entirely unwanted realization. The daughter he had spent decades treating like garbage was the only shield standing between him and a total, devastating ruin. "But since you want to point fingers," Zoe continued, her voice sharpening into a razor edge, "let us talk about where Julian got his seed money 10 years ago." The moment Zoe mentioned the seed money from a decade ago, the remaining color drained entirely from my mother's face. Susan let out a sharp gasp that sounded like a wounded bird. The sheer terror of having her perfectly constructed alternate reality shattered right in front of her was simply too much for her fragile ego to bear. She went into an absolute frenzy of denial. She lunged across the office rug and physically threw herself in front of my brother. She stretched her arms out wide, literally shielding a grown man who had just stolen millions of dollars from senior citizens. "Do not you dare!" Susan shrieked, her voice pitching so high it cracked and echoed painfully off the glass walls. "Do not you dare stand there and invent these ridiculous stories about my son. Julian did not steal anything 10 years ago, and he did not steal anything today. Maya is the thief. Maya has always been the thief. She turned her wild, frantic eyes toward Zoe, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. She stole her own college tuition 10 years ago. My mother screamed, her face flushed with desperate manufactured rage. She took that money, she went on a massive drug bender, and she completely disgraced us. She dropped out and rolled around in the gutter, while we had to face our friends and explain why our daughter was a complete failure. Julian is the only pure thing in this family. He worked for everything he has. He built his firm from scratch. Julian cowered behind her, gripping the back of her expensive designer jacket. He was 32 years old, yet he was hiding behind our mother exactly the way he did when we were children, and he had broken a window or stolen cash from our father's wallet. He let her scream the lies. He let her defend him with the very fiction that had destroyed my early 20s. He looked absolutely pathetic. My father stood frozen near the conference table, his eyes darting between Susan's hysterical breakdown and the red folder resting on my desk. He wanted to believe her. David desperately wanted to cling to the lie they had told themselves for a decade, because the alternative was admitting that his entire legacy was built on a foundation of absolute rot. My voice dropped to a deadly calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell over her frantic shrieking. I simply pushed my chair back and stood up. "You really convinced yourself of that lie, did you not, Mom?" I asked quietly. The sheer lack of emotion in my tone forced the room into an uneasy silence. Susan stopped screaming, her chest heaving as she glared at me with pure hatred. "You repeated that fabricated story to your friends, to the neighbors, and to yourselves for so many years that you actually forgot the truth." I continued, my voice steady and cold as ice. "You needed a villain to explain away the missing money, and you needed a saint to worship. So you simply assigned the roles and decided to believe your own fiction. You chose to sacrifice your daughter to protect the fragile ego of a son who never possessed an ounce of actual talent or integrity." I turned my back on them and walked slowly across the polished hardwood floor toward the far corner of my executive office. Embedded directly into the dark wood paneling was a flush matte black biometric safe. It was custom-built, heavily reinforced, and held the most sensitive proprietary contracts for TerraCycle Eco-Industrial. But it also held one personal item. One specific artifact from my past that I had sworn to keep locked away forever. I pressed my thumb against the glowing blue scanner. The machine let out a soft mechanical chirp, followed by the heavy click of the internal deadbolts retracting. I swung the heavy steel door open. "I am not the one who went on a bender." "Susan," I said deliberately, using her first name, "I did not touch a single cent of that tuition money. I was sitting in my dorm room studying for finals, while your pure, perfect son was sitting in a high-stakes underground poker game across town. He lost everything he had, and then he hacked into my student accounts, forged my digital signature, and wired my entire senior year tuition to a shell account to cover his massive losses before the bookies broke his legs." I reached into the small top drawer of the safe. My fingers brushed against a thick, sealed, heavily yellowed envelope. The edges were worn, and the paper was brittle from a decade of storage. It was the only thing I had taken with me when my parents kicked me out of their house. "That is a lie," my mother whimpered, though her voice lacked any of the fiery conviction it held moments before. "You are making this up to ruin him. You have always been jealous of him." I pulled the envelope from the safe and closed the heavy steel door. I walked slowly back to the center of the room, holding the aged paper in my hands. The entire room was completely silent. Even Julian had stopped his frantic breathing. He stared at the yellowed envelope, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He recognized it. He knew exactly what was inside. "When the university financial office flagged the fraudulent wire transfer," I said, looking directly at my father. "Now they launched a full investigation. The bank traced the IP address of the computer that authorized the transfer. It did not match my laptop. It matched the desktop computer sitting in Julian's bedroom at your house. They handed me the printed proof. They handed me the bank logs, the IP trace, and the confession Julian emailed to his bookie. They handed me everything I needed to send him to prison for wire fraud and identity theft. My father swallowed hard, his face turning an ashen gray. He remembered. The memories were flooding back, breaking through the dam of denial they had spent 10 years reinforcing. I brought this exact envelope to you, Dad. I continued, holding the aged paper up to the light. I sat at your kitchen table crying, holding the proof that Julian had stolen my future. And what did you do? My father looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I held on to this for a decade because you begged me on your knees not to ruin his life. I stated, my voice echoing with a heavy final authority. I tossed the sealed yellowed envelope onto the mahogany desk. It landed right next to Zoe's red fraud folder with a sharp, heavy thud. You got down on your actual knees, Susan, I said, turning my piercing gaze back to my mother. You grabbed my hands. You cried real tears and you begged me to take the fall. You told me that Julian was weak, that he would not survive a criminal record, that his entire future would be destroyed. You promised me that if I just kept quiet, if I just accepted the expulsion and took the blame, you would help me rebuild. You promised you would pay me back. The silence was absolutely suffocating. But the moment I agreed, the moment I sacrificed my reputation to save him from a prison cell, you turned your backs on me, I said, my voice filled with a decade of suppressed anger. You kicked me out of the house. You started telling everyone I was a drug addict. You called me a failure at every family gathering. You completely erased your own guilt by turning me into the villain. I pointed at the yellowed envelope resting on the desk. Well, the saint you protected just stole $3 million from innocent people to buy sports cars, I declared coldly. And all the proof of his original crime, the crime you helped cover up, is sitting right there on my desk. I reached across the desk and picked up the yellowed envelope. The aged paper crackled sharply in the dead silence of the office. I tipped it forward, sliding the contents out onto the polished mahogany surface. A thick stack of documents spilled out, settling right beside Zoe's catastrophic red folder. These were not digital printouts or fabricated spreadsheets. They were original hard-copy bank statements from exactly 10 years ago, accompanied by a heavy, stapled packet bearing the official seal of the local police department. I spread the papers apart with a single sweep of my hand, forcing my parents to look down at the undeniable proof of their golden child's true nature. At the center of the arrangement lay 3 canceled checks, each made out to a discreet holding company and each bearing a signature that vaguely resembled my own. Julian forged my signature, I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating air. I tapped my index finger against the largest check and authorization for $40,000. He did not just make a mistake. He sat at his desk staring at my old high school yearbooks and deliberately practiced tracing my name until he perfected it. He stole my entire college tuition because he was in debt to a violent sports gambling syndicate. He owed them $40,000, and they were threatening to put him in a hospital if he did not pay up by Friday. Susan tried to physically turn away, her hands flying up to cover her face, but I slammed my hand flat against the desk, the loud smack forcing her to look back at me. Do you remember the night the police knocked on our front door, Mom? I asked, stepping around the desk to close the distance between us. Do you remember the flashing red and blue lights illuminating our pristine suburban driveway? The bank had flagged the fraud. The investigators had traced the IP address directly to Julian's computer. The officers were standing in our foyer holding the arrest warrant that would have sent your perfect son to a state penitentiary. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling as the memories of his original disgrace flooded the room. You panicked. I continued, my gaze locked onto my mother's terrified face. You realized your social standing was about to be obliterated. So you grabbed me by the arm, dug your fingernails into my skin, and dragged me into the laundry room while Dad was talking to the police. You pulled a bottle of industrial bleach out of the cabinet. You unscrewed the cap, held that toxic liquid right up to your own mouth, and you threatened to drink it. You looked your 22-year-old daughter in the eyes and swore you would end your own life right there on the linoleum floor if I pressed charges against him. Susan let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, backing away from me until her spine hit the glass partition. She had no defense. She could not scream her way out of this reality. You begged me on your knees not to ruin his life, I said, my tone completely merciless. You sobbed and pleaded, promising me that if I just took the fall, if I just confessed to the transfer and accepted the consequences, you would pay me back. You swore we would handle it as a family. So I did it. I walked out of that laundry room, I looked at the police officers, and I lied. I confessed to a crime I did not commit to save a brother who never cared about me, simply to keep my mother from killing herself. I stepped back, letting the sheer gravity of her betrayal settle over the room. "And how did you reward my sacrifice?" I demanded. "The moment the police closed the case, the moment the university expelled me and seized my remaining assets, you threw me out on the street. You changed the locks. You spent the next decade attending your country club luncheons, sipping wine and calling me a degenerate dropout. You told everyone who would listen that I went on a massive drug bender, stole my own tuition, and disgraced the family. You used my forced sacrifice as a punchline to elevate Julian." David stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant, blustering patriarch who had stormed into my office demanding a job for his son was entirely gone. He stared at the documents scattered across my desk. Slowly, as if moving underwater, my father stepped forward. His hands shook violently as he reached out and picked up the police report. He read the official summary. He saw the documented IP addresses, the timeline of the gambling debts, and the notes regarding the forged checks. The paper rattled in his trembling grip. David turned his head slowly, his eyes fixing on Julian. He desperately needed his son to fight back. He needed Julian to scream, to deny the accusations, to call the police report a fabrication. He needed his golden boy to maintain the illusion just a little bit longer. "Julian," my father whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate pleading edge. "Tell me this is fake. Tell me you did not let your sister take the fall for your crimes." Julian did absolutely nothing. He stood there staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped and his face devoid of any color. He could not form a single word of defense. His profound, terrifying silence filled the room, acting as a screaming, deafening confession that instantly obliterated the last remaining fragments of David's constructed reality. Julian was a thief. He had always been a thief. The police report slipped from my father's shaking fingers, fluttering down to rest on the rug. David's breathing became shallow and ragged as his brain frantically tried to calculate the sheer magnitude of the destruction surrounding him. His son was not a victim of a corporate setup. His son was a federal criminal who had just stolen $3 million, and the government was currently seizing everything the family owned. Their massive house, their luxury cars, their entire social standing. It was all going to be incinerated by the Department of Justice. David looked at me. He looked at my tailored designer suit, my massive corner office, and the billionaire fraud auditor standing silently by my side. He realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that I was the only person in the room who possessed actual wealth, actual power, and actual influence. But instead of falling to his knees to apologize for a decade of horrific, unforgivable abuse, David's expression shifted. The shock evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of frantic, calculating desperation as his survival instincts kicked in. David did not apologize. He did not look at the undeniable proof of my innocence and beg for my forgiveness. Instead, his eyes darted from the yellowed police report on the floor to the expensive panoramic view outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, and finally to the designer suit I was wearing. The shock on his face evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a frantic, calculating desperation that made my stomach turn. He stepped forward, his expensive leather shoe planting itself directly on top of the original police report I had kept for 10 years. He literally trampled the proof of my stolen future without a second thought. "Okay, fine," David stammered, his voice gaining a frantic, terrifying momentum. He waved his hand dismissively through the air as if waving away a minor parking ticket rather than a string of federal felonies. He made a mistake when he was a kid. He was young Maya. He was under a lot of pressure from his peers and he made a bad call, and he made a mistake now. The market is tough right now. High finance is a brutal game and everyone bends the rules occasionally. He just got in over his head. I stared at him in absolute disbelief. He was actively attempting to minimize the theft of $3 million from elderly pensioners as a simple miscalculation. David closed the distance between us. He lunged across my mahogany desk and grabbed my arm. His grip was painfully tight, his manicured fingernails digging sharply into the fabric of my suit jacket. Marcus stepped forward instantly, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards as he reached for David's collar, but I held up my free hand, signaling the security guard to stop. I wanted to see this. I needed to witness the absolute depths of my family's depravity. "But you are rich, Maya," David shouted, his eyes wide and wild as he shook my arm. "You own this whole company. You have built an empire here." Susan immediately stopped crying. The moment my father pointed out my wealth, her hysterical sobbing ceased as if a switch had been flipped. She wiped her tear-streaked face and looked at me, her eyes widening with a sudden greedy hope. Even Julian lifted his head. The pathetic, whimpering coward actually dared to look at me with a spark of expectation in his bloodshot eyes. They were no longer looking at the daughter they had discarded. They were looking at a walking, breathing ATM machine. $3 million is absolutely nothing to you," David insisted, his voice rising into a fever pitch of toxic entitlement. "You are sitting in a multi-million-dollar corporate headquarters. You have billionaire venture capital auditors working for you. You can fix this entire mess with a single phone call. You just wire the $3 million to Julian's firm right now. We cover the deficit. We quietly pay back those retired people before they even notice the money was moved, and Vanguard drops the investigation. Everyone wins." I did not say a word. I let him dig his grave deeper, watching the ugly reality of his character completely expose itself under the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. "Do not just stand there looking at me like that with that cold expression," David shouted, his grip tightening further on my arm. "You owe us. We gave you life. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. We clothed you. We fed you when you had nothing. You are blood, Maya. Family protects family when things get tough. Pay Vanguard back right now and we can sweep this under the rug." Susan scurried forward, stepping right next to my father and nodding frantically. "Yes, Maya, please. We will welcome you back into the family. We will tell everyone at the country club that we were wrong about you. You can come to Thanksgiving dinner next month. You can have your old childhood room back. We will be a real family again. Julian will apologize, will you not, Julian?" "I am sorry, Maya," Julian whined from the corner, his voice trembling with pathetic desperation. "It was just a temporary loan. I was going to pay them back. Please, just write the check. Do not let me go to prison." I looked at the three of them. They were offering to trade my lifelong trauma for a $3 million bailout. They were offering me a seat at their toxic, abusive dining room table in exchange for saving a felon from the consequences of his own disastrous actions. They possessed absolutely zero morality. Their entire existence was purely transactional. "You want me to sweep the financial ruin of retired teachers and nurses under the rug?" I said softly, almost to myself. "You threw me out on the curb with a black trash bag full of clothes when I was 22, and now you want me to write a $3 million check to save the man who put me there." "That is in the past," David yelled, his face turning red. "Nobody has to go to prison today. You write that check and we can finally be a real family again. Just write the damn check." I looked down at my father's hand gripping my forearm. I did not yank my arm away. I did not flinch or shout. I reached over with my free hand and calmly, deliberately peeled his fingers off my jacket one by one. I pushed his hand back toward his chest with a cold, immovable force, stepping out of his physical reach. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my sleeve, taking a slow, steady breath as I looked directly into David's frantic eyes. "I do not owe Vanguard anything, Dad," I stated quietly, my voice devoid of any warmth or sympathy. "And I could not write a check to Julian's firm even if I wanted to." David frowned, his face twisting in sudden confusion. "What do you mean you cannot write a check? You own TerraCycle?" I looked past my father and gestured toward Zoe, who had been standing silently by the glass partition, watching the entire pathetic display with an expression of absolute predatory amusement. "Tell them why," I commanded softly. Marcus stepped forward, his massive hand closing firmly around Julian's bicep to haul him toward the frosted glass doors. Julian thrashed weakly, the fight completely draining from his muscles as the reality of a massive corporate lockdown loomed over him. I nodded at Marcus. He released my brother and stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest while blocking the only exit. The heavy silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing of my family. Zoe flipped open the heavy red cardboard cover. Crisp, detailed financial spreadsheets, Federal audit logs, and highlighted banking ledgers spilled across the mahogany surface. She reached into the pocket of the folder and pulled out a stack of glossy photographs. She did not look at Julian. She looked directly at my parents, who were clinging to each other in the center of the room, like passengers on a sinking ship. "Your son is not a financial genius," Zoe stated, her tone clinical and merciless. "He is a parasite." For the past 4 years, Julian has been operating a highly sophisticated shadow scheme beneath the legitimate operations of his brokerage firm. When his legitimate investments began to tank, he panicked. Instead of taking the loss and reporting the downturn to his investors, he created a series of dummy shell corporations to hide the deficit. Zoe slid a glossy photograph across the desk. It showed Julian smiling brightly behind the wheel of a brand-new custom-ordered luxury sports car. He actively embezzled exactly $3 million from the private retirement portfolios of his most vulnerable elderly clients. Zoe continued sliding more photographs and highlighted bank statements toward my trembling parents. He completely drained the life savings of retired teachers, nurses, and factory workers. And where did that stolen money go? It did not go into market recovery efforts. It went into Maseratis for his weekend trips. It paid for his exorbitant platinum-tier country club memberships. It funded his lavish vacations to Europe. Zoe picked up a specific ledger and locked her icy gaze on my mother. Susan shrank back as if the piece of paper were a loaded weapon. "It also funded your lifestyle, Susan," Zoe said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "That lavish Thanksgiving dinner you hosted, the imported caviar, the vintage French champagne, the exotic floral centerpieces, that was all paid for with stolen retirement funds. The recent luxury renovations to your suburban home were financed through a shell company Julian set up, using a defrauded client's social security number. You have been living like royalty on the backs of senior citizens who are now completely bankrupt." The color drained entirely from my mother's face. Her knees buckled, and my father had to catch her by the waist to keep her from collapsing onto the floor. The performative arrogance they had carried into my office was completely obliterated. They were not just the parents of a successful broker anymore. They were the direct beneficiaries of a massive federal crime. The government would be seizing their house, their cars, and every single luxury item Julian had ever gifted them. Julian went completely pale. He grabbed the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning white. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for a magical escape hatch. His carefully constructed facade of superiority was melting right off his bones. "It is a clerical error," Julian stuttered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch. "It is just a simple misallocation of funds. David, you know how these massive institutional transfers work. My accountants made a mistake with the automated routing numbers during a bulk trade sequence. I was going to put the money back. I just needed one good quarter to leverage the returns and replace the principal capital. It is a victimless overlap. You cannot send me to prison for a temporary liquidity issue." Zoe did not even blink at his desperate, transparent lies. "You do not accidentally misallocate $3 million into a private offshore account to buy Italian sports cars," Julian Zoe replied flatly. "You are going to a federal penitentiary and your assets are going to be liquidated at public auction." My father suddenly snapped. The fragile illusion of his perfect family was shattering into a million sharp pieces, and his brain simply refused to process the reality of his golden boy's absolute depravity. David could not blame his son. He had spent his entire life worshipping Julian. So his frantic, desperate mind immediately locked onto the only target he had ever known how to attack. David lunged forward, his expensive dress shoes scuffing against the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. "You set him up!" My father roared, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as spittle flew from his lips. "You used your corporate connections to frame your brother because you have always hated him. You could never stand the fact that he was more successful than you. You run this massive company, and you used your billionaire friends to hack into his accounts and move that money to frame him. You fabricated this entire audit to destroy our family out of pure vindictive spite." I stared at the man who had raised me, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no desire to scream back. He was a pathetic, delusional man clinging to a sinking ship. He was willing to invent an insane corporate espionage conspiracy rather than admit his son was a common thief. I did not even have to open my mouth to defend myself. Zoe stepped squarely between my father and my desk, her posture radiating absolute authority. She looked at David with pure pity. It was the kind of look one gives to a confused, wounded animal that does not realize the fight is already over. Maya did not frame him. Zoe said, her voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. Maya is the one who flagged the anomaly to save your family from federal prison. My father's mouth fell open. He froze mid-step, his arm dropping slowly to his side as Zoe's words struck him like physical blows. When Vanguard's algorithms first detected the massive irregularities in Julian's firm, the federal mandate required us to immediately freeze all connected assets. Zoe explained, her tone completely merciless. That includes the domestic and offshore accounts of any family members who received suspicious financial gifts or co-signed on fraudulent collateral. The Department of Justice was prepared to padlock your front doors this morning. Maya stepped in and leveraged her own corporate portfolio to stall the asset seizure on your personal home. She guaranteed your debts with her own legitimate capital to buy you exactly 48 hours to hire legal counsel before the feds seize everything you own. She saved you from being handcuffed on your own front lawn. David looked at me, his eyes wide with a horrified, entirely unwanted realization. The daughter he had spent decades treating like garbage was the only shield standing between him and a total, devastating ruin. But since you want to point fingers, Zoe continued, her voice sharpening into a razor edge, let us talk about where Julian got his seed money 10 years ago. Zoe uncrossed her arms, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood as she prepared to answer my command. She did not just hold the document up, she thrust it into Julian's line of sight, forcing him to read the bold, stark lettering. Read the header, Julian. Zoe instructed, her tone sharp and commanding. Read the names of the primary signatories. Julian squinted, his chest heaving rapidly. His eyes darted across the thick premium paper. The color that had rushed to his face in his fit of rage instantly drained away, leaving him looking like a bloodless corpse. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling gasp emerged from his throat. You thought Vanguard was simply conducting a routine quarterly audit? Zoe said, her voice echoing with absolute finality. You thought they were just looking at your books and sending a warning letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission. You arrogant, narrow-minded fool. Vanguard does not just flag toxic assets, they eliminate them. And when they realized your firm was hemorrhaging millions of dollars in stolen retirement funds, they did not call the police first. They called us. Julian shook his head, stumbling backward a fraction of an inch. No, my board would never approve a sale without my authorization. I am a founding partner. You were a founding partner, I corrected him, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Your board of directors consists of cowards and opportunists. The moment Vanguard presented them with the federal audit, proving you were embezzling from the elderly, they panicked. They knew they were facing accessory charges and decades in federal prison. They were desperate to liquidate their shares and jump off your sinking ship. Zoe tapped the pristine document. Vanguard facilitated the transaction. They approached TerraCycle Eco-Industrial with an exclusive offer. They provided the audit data, and we provided the capital. We spent the last month quietly purchasing the distressed debt of your firm. We bought out your silent partners. We absorbed your liabilities. We acquired the deed to the building where your corner office sits. We did all of this right under your nose. My father stared at me, his jaw slack with uncomprehending horror. Maya, what did you do? I did what I always do, Dad, I replied coldly. I cleaned up a toxic mess. I cleaned up. I walked slowly around the edge of my desk, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I stopped just a few feet away from my brother. He was shaking uncontrollably now. The aggressive, towering bully who had tried to intimidate me moments ago was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, ruined boy who finally realized he was entirely outmatched. You thought you were invincible because you operated in the shadows. Zoe explained, her tone relentless. You utilized offshore accounts and routed the stolen funds through dummy corporations to mask the paper trail. It was a decent effort for an amateur, but Vanguard forensic algorithms track fractional discrepancies across global markets. When they found the missing 3 million, they traced the digital fingerprints directly back to your personal IP address at the firm. They had you dead to rights, but prosecuting you would have caused a massive public scandal for your board of directors. It would have triggered a run on the firm's legitimate assets. They needed a quiet exit strategy. And that is where I stepped in. I said, taking over the explanation. I offered your board a lifeline. TerraCycle purchased their shares at a premium, injecting immediate liquidity into the firm to cover the massive hole you created in the ledger. We effectively bought their silence and their cooperation. In exchange, they handed me the keys to your kingdom. Do you remember Thanksgiving Day? I asked, keeping my gaze locked on his panicked eyes. You sat at the head of the table. You poured vintage French wine. You bragged about your massive quarterly bonuses and your brand new sports car. You looked at me across the turkey and made a joke about how TerraCycle was just a glorified garbage collection agency. Julian swallowed hard, unable to look away. While you were carving the turkey that you bought with stolen money, I continued, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. I was sitting in my home office with Zoe and a team of corporate lawyers. While you were making jokes about my career, I was signing the preliminary acquisition papers to buy your entire professional existence. Julian let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He reached out as if to grab the document from Zoe, but his hands were trembling too violently to close his fingers. He shook his head frantically. You cannot fire me. I have a golden parachute clause in my contract. You owe me a severance package. You owe me millions in stock options. Zoe actually laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. Your golden parachute was voided the moment you committed gross financial misconduct. Section 4 of your founding charter explicitly states that any partner found guilty of embezzling client funds forfeits all equity stock options and severance benefits. You walk away with absolutely nothing. TerraCycle just acquired a 51% majority stake in your investment firm, Julian Zoe announced with a surgical smile. We own the controlling interest. We own your client lists. We own your intellectual property. We own your entire corporate infrastructure. Zoe stepped closer, delivering the final crushing blow. Maya isn't just your sister, Zoe stated, her voice ringing with absolute authority. As of 8 o'clock this morning, she is the chairman of your board. She is your boss. And she was the one who officially signed your termination papers. Julian's knees literally gave out. The sheer weight of his total, inescapable destruction crashed down on his shoulders all at once. The fight completely drained from his muscles. He staggered backward, his legs hitting the edge of a heavy leather guest chair, and he collapsed into it like a puppet with severed strings. He buried his face in his hands, gasping for air, as a dry, heavy sob ripped through his chest. He had nothing. He possessed no firm, no money, no leverage, and no future. He was a terminated employee waiting for the federal authorities to drag him away in handcuffs. David stood frozen near the door, staring at his broken son. The illusion of the golden boy was permanently, irreversibly shattered. The reality of Julian's pathetic nature was laid bare in the center of my office. But the toxic family dynamic persisted. The deeply ingrained delusion that had fueled my parents for decades could not simply be erased by facts or financial ruin. Susan refused to bend. Her perfect reality had been incinerated. Her golden child was sobbing in a chair, and her entire social standing was about to be obliterated by a federal indictment. Yet her fragile, monstrous ego demanded that she maintain her superiority. She could not accept defeat. She could not accept that the daughter she had discarded was the ultimate victor. Susan stepped forward. She literally stepped over Julian's outstretched legs, completely ignoring her son's broken, hyperventilating state. She marched right up to my desk, her spine rigid, and her chin thrust into the air. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure, undiluted venom. "We don't need her money!" Susan shrieked, turning her head to snap at my father. "Stand up straight, David. Do not let her speak to us this way." She turned her furious gaze back to me, her face twisting into a mask of defiant arrogance. "We have our own. You cannot take out a second mortgage, Mom. Not when you have not paid the first one in 8 months." I tapped the surface of my iPad. Instantly, the massive 85-inch OLED monitor mounted on the far wall of my executive office flared to life. The pristine minimalist corporate logo of TerraCycle vanished, replaced by a glaring high-resolution mosaic of absolute financial catastrophe. Crisp PDF scans of final bank notices, certified default warnings, and aggressive foreclosure mandates plastered the screen. The hostile red ink of past due balances, compounding penalty fees, and legal threats glared down at my parents, illuminating their pale faces in the dimming afternoon light. I zoomed in on the central document, a final notice of acceleration from their primary mortgage lender, detailing a catastrophic 8-month delinquency on their sprawling $2 million suburban estate. Susan gasped, physically stumbling backward as if the television screen had emitted a shockwave. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She threw her hands up, shaking her head frantically side to side. "Those are fabricated," Susan stammered, her eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for anyone to validate her sudden suffocating delusion. "David, tell her she is lying. Tell her these are fake documents she had her corporate tech department doctor up just to scare us. This is just another one of her vindictive little games." "They are very real," Susan Zoe stated flatly. She stepped up to the monitor and pointed a manicured finger directly at the official bank seals stamped at the bottom of the PDFs. "These are certified legal copies acquired directly from your lender's asset management department. You have been in active default since April. You are currently hundreds of thousands of dollars in arrears." I walked around to the front of my desk, leaning back against the heavy mahogany edge. I crossed my arms and looked directly at the people who had spent my entire childhood treating me like an unwanted, embarrassing burden. "You thought you were being so incredibly clever," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, which only seemed to unnerve them more. "You thought you could play the system and win." 8 months ago, Julian's fraudulent shell companies started collapsing under the weight of his own staggering incompetence. He needed liquid cash immediately to pay off the early investors of his Ponzi scheme before they started asking the authorities questions. He came crying to Mommy and Daddy, begging for a bailout so the federal auditors would not catch the scent of his massive embezzlement. Julian groaned from his chair, curling into a tighter ball, pulling his knees up defensively. He was completely unable to even look at the screen, broadcasting his ultimate failure. They offered the money. Julian muttered, his voice muffled behind his hands. He was instantly willing to throw his own parents under the bus to mitigate his guilt. I told them it was a guaranteed return. They wanted in on the ground floor. I did not force them to drain their accounts. Susan whipped her head around to stare at her golden child, her jaw dropping open in absolute shock as he deflected the blame directly onto her. "So what did the brilliant, financially savvy parents of the year do?" I asked, my voice cutting through the rising tension, ensuring the focus remained exactly where it belonged. "You stopped paying the mortgage on your precious $2 million estate. You took every single dime of your monthly housing payments, bundled them with your remaining liquid retirement funds, and funneled it all directly into Julian's offshore investment fund to keep his illegal operations afloat. You actively starved your own home to feed a parasite." David's face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. Sweat began to pour down his temples, soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. The reality of his catastrophic gamble was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had bet his entire life, his reputation, and his shelter on Julian. And Julian had lost everything. "The bank gave us an extension," David blurted out, his voice cracking with a desperate, frantic energy. He lunged a step forward, raising a shaking hand toward the monitor, as if he could wipe the documents away. "It was a bridge strategy. Julian swore to us he had a massive tech merger closing in the 4th quarter. He promised he was going to double our money by Christmas. We were going to pay the arrears in one lump sum and clear the principal capital completely." You trusted a man who steals from retired public school teachers to execute a high-level corporate merger. Zoe asked, her voice laced with genuine, unfiltered disbelief. The absolute magnitude of your stupidity belongs in a financial textbook. They understood the delay, David shouted, turning his frantic gaze to Zoe, completely ignoring her insult. He was sweating profusely now, his chest heaving as he tried to piece together a defense for his indefensible actions. I spoke to the regional director of the bank myself. We play golf at the same country club. He assured me that foreclosure was an absolute last resort for long-term clients like us. He said they sold our debt to a private holding company that would restructure the loan and give us a new payment plan. They promised us a restructuring option. My father looked at me, his eyes wide and panicked, silently begging me to validate the corporate lie he had swallowed whole. He was clinging to the word restructuring like a drowning man holding onto a broken piece of driftwood, entirely oblivious to the fact that it was the very thing pulling him under the water. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. I pushed off the edge of the mahogany desk and took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward my father. You really have no idea how the real corporate world operates, do you? Dad? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper. You have spent your entire life hiding in your comfortable suburban bubble, pretending to be a titan of industry because you manage a mid-level regional supply chain. You think a golf course handshake protects you from algorithmic risk assessment. You do not know the first thing about ruthless corporate finance. David swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw ticking frantically as my words stripped away his remaining pride. When a major commercial bank writes off toxic debt, they do not do it to do you a personal favor, I explained, enunciating every single word so it would carve itself permanently into his brain. They do not sell your defaulted mortgage to a private holding company so you can get a friendly little restructuring plan. They sell it to purge a liability from their quarterly earnings report. They sell your debt for pennies on the dollar to aggressive corporate liquidation firms who have absolutely zero interest in keeping you in your home. Susan let out a small, terrified whimper. She reached out and clutched David's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. Those private holding companies buy your debt for one specific reason. I continued, leaning forward until I was just inches from his sweating face. They buy it to accelerate the foreclosure process, bypass the standard grace periods, seize the physical property, and sell your $2 million estate at a public auction to maximize their immediate profit margins. They do not want your delayed monthly payments. They want the deed to your house. David stared at me, his breathing ragged and shallow, the horrifying truth finally settling heavy into his bones. His eyes darted nervously to the massive screen displaying his financial death warrant, then back to my face. I leaned across the desk, bracing my hands flat against the polished wood, trapping his gaze with my own. Dad, in the corporate world, when a bank writes off toxic debt, they sell it for pennies on the dollar to liquidation firms. Do you know the name of the holding company that bought your debt? I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The air in the room felt entirely depleted of oxygen as I dropped it onto the glass surface. I pressed my palm flat against the cool leather and slid the heavy, notarized deed folder across the desk directly into my father's trembling hands. David looked down. His bloodshot eyes tracked across the bold gold lettering stamped into the center of the dark leather cover. It read TerraCycle Real Estate Holdings, LLC. He stared at the words as if they were written in a foreign language. His brain, already fractured by the revelation of Julian's federal crimes, simply refused to process the brutal reality sitting right in front of him. He opened the folder with shaking, clammy fingers. Crisp legal documents, property transfer certificates, and a finalized bank mandate stared back at him. Every single page was stamped sealed and legally binding. I bought your debt, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. I bought it last week. The bank was absolutely thrilled to offload a severely delinquent $2 million mortgage attached to a family currently under federal investigation. They sold it to my holding company for a fraction of the principal balance just to scrub the liability from their fourth quarter earnings report. David looked up from the documents, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had just been told his terminal diagnosis was not only accurate, but immediate. "You own the debt," David whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, hollow rasp. "I do not just own the debt, Dad," I corrected him, my tone completely merciless. "I own the actual property. When you defaulted on the acceleration clause to bail out your felon of a son, you triggered an automatic forfeiture. My legal team executed a deed in lieu of foreclosure. The title transfer was finalized yesterday morning. You are currently standing in an office you do not own, begging for a house you no longer possess." Susan stepped forward, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the floor. She snatched the folder from David's hands, her eyes scanning the legal jargon with a desperate, frantic intensity. Her perfect, manicured world was collapsing, and her mind immediately sought refuge in the only defense mechanism she had ever known. She attacked. "This is sick," Susan hissed, throwing the folder back onto the desk. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, clinging to her evaporating status like a physical shield. "You are a sick, vindictive girl. You orchestrated this entire nightmare just to humiliate us. You used your dirty corporate money to steal our family home." "I did not steal anything, Mom," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "You threw it away. You willingly handed the keys to your life over to a man who steals from the elderly to fund his sports cars. But please tell me more about my dirty corporate money." I stood up, completely towering over my mother's shrinking posture. "You would not even invite me to Thanksgiving dinner last year," I said, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "You told Aunt Clara that you were too embarrassed to have me sitting at your table. You told her I was just a glorified garbage woman playing with recycling bins, and you did not want my lack of class ruining your perfect holiday aesthetic." Susan flinched, stepping backward as the exact quote struck her. "But the absolute best part of that entire holiday," I continued, a cold surgical smile spreading across my face, "is that while you were sitting there insulting my career, you were already completely bankrupt. You were eating imported caviar and drinking vintage champagne on credit cards you could not pay off. You ate that Thanksgiving turkey in my dining room, Susan. I own your house. I own the dining room table. I own the crystal chandeliers you love to brag about. I own the roof over your head." Susan's face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate hatred. The realization that her despised daughter held the ultimate power over her physical survival shattered her fragile ego. She could not accept the defeat. She needed to draw blood. "Wealth has made you completely unnatural." Susan spat, her voice vibrating with malice. "You sit in this cold glass tower tearing your own family apart and you smile about it. You always lacked empathy. You were always a cold, unfeeling child who never understood how to love anyone but yourself. That is exactly why you are 33 and completely alone, Maya. No man will ever want a woman who behaves like a ruthless corporate monster. You have money, but you have absolutely nothing else." She glared at me, her chest heaving, waiting for the insult to land. She expected to see a flash of pain, a flicker of the insecure little girl who used to cry in her bedroom when her mother called her unlovable. She wanted me to bleed. I just smiled. I did not feel a single ounce of pain. Her words meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. They were the desperate, pathetic flailings of a woman who had just realized she was entirely irrelevant. I slowly reached out and tapped the screen of my iPad. "You are right about one thing, Mom," I said smoothly. "I am completely ruthless." I projected my iPad screen directly onto the large television monitor mounted on the far wall of the office. A bright, glaring document flashed onto the screen. It was not a bank statement or a corporate audit. It was a formal, legally binding notice to vacate. "You cannot take out a second mortgage, Mom," I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "Not when you have not paid the first one in 8 months. And you certainly cannot use my property to secure a loan for Julian. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises before my security team physically removes you from my property." Susan stared at the glaring eviction notice. The words burned into her retinas. The absolute reality of her situation finally breached the fortress of her delusion. She had no leverage, she had no money, she had no power, she had no home. Julian could not save her. David could not save her. The high society life she had built on a foundation of lies and stolen funds was officially terminated. Susan's rigid posture suddenly collapsed. Her shoulders slumped forward, and a loud, ragged sob tore from her throat. She buried her face in her hands, her designer rings catching the light as she burst into heavy, uncontrollable tears. She wept for her lost status, for her ruined golden boy, and for the devastating truth that the daughter she hated was the architect of her absolute destruction. David stood beside her, paralyzed, unable to even reach out and comfort his sobbing wife. Julian remained curled in the guest chair, staring blankly at the floor. The room fell completely suffocatingly silent. The only sound was the pathetic, ragged weeping of my mother echoing against the expensive glass walls of my empire. Then a loud rhythmic knocking came from the heavy glass doors of the office. The rhythmic knocking echoed through the executive suite like the tolling of a bell. Through the frosted glass panes of my office doors, 3 imposing silhouettes loomed. Before I could even issue a command for my security team to clear the entrance, Marcus, my head of security, stepped aside and pulled the heavy glass doors open. 3 men strode into the room. They were not wearing tailored Italian suits or carrying designer briefcases. They wore standard-issue dark windbreakers. Silver badges hung heavily from thick chains around their necks, catching the afternoon light. The letters emblazoned across the back of their jackets were unmistakable. Economic Crimes Division. The air in the office instantly crystallized. The ambient hum of the corporate building seemed to completely vanish, leaving a vacuum of absolute dread. Susan stopped weeping, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared at the badges. David took an involuntary step backward, instinctively raising his hands in a posture of surrender. The lead detective, a tall man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen decades of corporate fraud, stepped squarely into the center of the room. His gaze swept over the shattered remnants of my family before locking onto the cowering figure in the guest chair. "We are looking for Julian Thorne," the detective announced, his voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. Julian let out a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. The confident, arrogant golden boy who had just threatened to ruin my company was instantly vaporized. In his place was a pathetic, trembling shell of a man. His bespoke suit suddenly looked entirely too large for him, hanging off his hunched shoulders. As he scrambled backward in the leather chair, trying to meld into the upholstery, he looked wildly at David. "Dad!" Julian squeaked, his voice cracking into a panicked, prepubescent pitch. "Dad, do something. Call your lawyers. Tell them they cannot be here." It was the exact same desperate pleading tone he had used when he crashed his first luxury car into a storefront at 19. It was the same terrified look he flashed our mother when the dean of his university threatened him with expulsion for plagiarizing his final thesis. It was the exact behavior he exhibited when he racked up $50,000 in credit card debt by age 22. For his entire life, Julian had treated consequences like temporary inconveniences that his parents could simply sweep away with a frantic phone call and a massive check. He had been conditioned to believe that accountability was a concept meant strictly for the lower classes and the unwanted daughters. He was the golden child. He was untouchable. "Fix this!" Julian shrieked, tears springing to his eyes as he thrashed his arms toward Susan. "Mom, call the bank. Tell them it is a mistake. Write them a check. Pay them whatever they want. You have to stop them from touching me." But Susan just stood there, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. There were no checks left to write. I had just demonstrated with absolute, irrefutable proof that their accounts were drained, their assets were frozen, and their home was officially my property. The magical safety net they had provided for him for 3 decades was completely gone, incinerated by his own boundless greed. Julian, the lead detective, said, stepping closer and pulling a folded piece of paper from his inner jacket pocket. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and violating the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." "No!" Julian screamed, kicking his legs out like a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "You do not understand. I am a vice president. I manage high net worth portfolios. You cannot just walk in here and arrest me. My firm will destroy you. My father has connections." Zoe leaned against the wall, crossing her arms and watching the meltdown with profound disgust. "You do not have a firm anymore, Julian," she reminded him coldly. "You are currently a terminated employee, trespassing on TerraCycle property." The two younger detectives moved in from the flanks completely unfazed by his pathetic flailing. They had dealt with countless white-collar criminals, men who believed their expensive haircuts and country club memberships granted them immunity from the law. They grabbed Julian by the biceps and hauled him roughly to his feet. Julian shrieked a raw, animalistic sound of pure terror. He thrashed against their grip, but his soft, manicured hands were useless against seasoned federal agents. The lead detective reached to his belt. The sharp, heavy metallic clink of steel handcuffs being drawn from their leather pouch sliced through the air. That sound broke the final thread of Julian's sanity. The physical reality of the cold steel meant prison. It meant orange jumpsuits, public humiliation, the total liquidation of his assets, and the absolute destruction of his massive ego. He realized in that split second that his mother could not shield him, his father could not buy his way out, and I was standing there watching his demise with absolute unblinking satisfaction. Cornered and facing decades behind bars, Julian's survival instinct kicked into overdrive. The loyalty he supposedly held for the parents who had worshipped the ground he walked on evaporated instantly. If he was going down, he was going to use anyone he could as a human shield to lessen the impact. He would burn down the entire family tree if it meant knocking a few years off his sentence. "Wait!" Julian screamed, his eyes bulging as he fought the detectives, pulling his arms backward. "Wait! You have to listen to me. I can give you information. I can cooperate with the investigation." The lead detective paused, holding the handcuffs steady. "You have the right to remain silent," he recited smoothly. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. I am not the only one." Julian yelled, spittle flying from his lips as he twisted his head around. He ripped his arm forward just enough to point a shaking, desperate finger directly across the room. He aimed it straight at David and Susan. "It was them," Julian shrieked, his voice echoing with absolute venomous betrayal. "They knew everything from the very beginning. They funded the offshore accounts. They gave me the capital to bridge the missing client funds. They funneled their mortgage payments into my shell companies to hide the deficits from the federal regulators. They are co-conspirators. Arrest them too." The words hung in the air, a toxic cloud of betrayal that choked the remaining life out of the room. David and Susan reeled backward simultaneously, their bodies jerking, as if Julian had just drawn a weapon and fired it directly into their chests. The son they had worshipped, the golden child they had sacrificed, their own daughter for the man they had willingly driven themselves into absolute bankruptcy to protect, had just offered them up to federal authorities without a single second of hesitation. Julian did not stop. The dam had broken, and a flood of desperate, frantic self-preservation poured out of him. He strained against the grip of the two younger detectives, leaning his head forward toward the lead investigator, his eyes wide and manic. "I have the bank records!" Julian screamed, his voice echoing shrilly off the expensive glass walls of my office. "I can prove it. Check the routing numbers on their joint checking account. December 14th, I wired them $80,000. They told me they needed it to cover their property taxes. But Mom went out the very next week and bought that brand new silver Mercedes. Ask her for the keys. Ask her how a woman who has not worked in 30 years bought a luxury vehicle in cash while her husband's business was stagnating." "Julian, stop this!" David roared, his voice cracking horribly. The commanding, authoritative tone he had used to terrorize me during my childhood was completely gone. He sounded like a weak, terrified old man. He raised a shaking hand, pointing at his son. "Close your mouth right now. We are your parents. You are confused. You do not know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying," Julian spat back, spittle flying from his lips. The pristine facade of the successful investment banker was entirely gone, replaced by a cornered rat willing to chew through its own family to escape a trap. I am not taking the fall for this alone. I am not spending the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary while you two sit in your country club pretending you did not know where the money came from. Susan clutched her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid. She took a stumbling step toward Julian, her hands outstretched in a pathetic, pleading gesture. "Julian, my baby, please." Susan begged, fresh tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "We did this to protect you. We drained our mortgage payments to help you cover your deficits. We gave you everything we had. We lost our home for you. How can you say these terrible things to the police? We are your family." "You wanted the payout!" Julian screamed, completely unmoved by her tears. He glared at the woman who had coddled him his entire life with absolute, undisguised contempt. "Do not stand there and act like a martyr. You wanted the country club dues paid. You wanted the kitchen remodeled. Dad knew the returns were fake. I told him in his study on Thanksgiving Day. I told him the accounts were hemorrhaging, and he told me to just keep printing the fabricated quarterly statements so the board of directors would not suspect anything. He even helped me set up the shell company in Delaware to route the stolen client funds. They are co-conspirators. I want a plea deal. I will testify against them." David staggered backward, his shoulders hitting the heavy mahogany paneling of the office wall. He slid down a few inches, his legs trembling under the crushing weight of his son's absolute treachery. The reality of the situation washed over him in a sickening, freezing wave. They had alienated their only competent child. They had lost their $2 million estate. They had destroyed their financial future. And they had done it all for a boy who would not hesitate to throw them to the wolves just to shave a few years off his federal sentence. Zoe stood perfectly still beside my desk, her arms crossed, watching the catastrophic implosion of the Thorne family with cold, clinical fascination. I remained leaning against the edge of the polished wood, my expression entirely neutral. I did not need to say a single word. The toxic narcissistic family dynamic they had carefully cultivated for 3 decades was finally eating itself alive right in front of me. There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves, and Julian was proving that in spectacular fashion. The lead detective watched the exchange with the detached, calculating gaze of a man who had seen this exact scenario play out 100 times before. He did not look surprised by Julian's cowardice. He simply signaled to his partners. The 2 younger detectives yanked Julian's arms sharply behind his back. The heavy metallic clicking of the steel handcuffs ratcheting tight echoed sharply in the quiet room. Julian let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine as the cold metal locked around his wrists, but he stopped fighting. The physical reality of the handcuffs seemed to drain the remaining adrenaline from his body, leaving him slumping weakly between the 2 federal agents. The lead detective turned his attention away from the ruined son and slowly shifted his gaze to the stunned, hyperventilating parents. He reached his large, calloused hand into the inner pocket of his dark windbreaker. He did not pull out a notepad. He pulled out a secondary thick manila folder. It was heavily stuffed with what looked like bank transcripts, highlighted routing numbers, and printed email logs. He stepped squarely into the center of the room, placing himself directly between Julian and my parents. The sheer authority radiating from his presence made the air in the room feel impossibly heavy. He looked down at the label on the thick folder, then looked up, his eyes locking onto David and Susan with piercing, unforgiving intensity. "Is this true?" the lead detective asked, his voice low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "Did you knowingly receive embezzled client funds? Did you actively participate in shielding these financial anomalies from federal auditors?" Susan let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. David's eyes darted frantically around the room, desperately searching the glass walls, the closed doors, the minimalist decor for any possible escape route. He had no powerful lawyers on retainer anymore. He had no liquid assets to post bail. He had no collateral to leverage. His entire existence had been vaporized in a single afternoon. Slowly, agonizingly, David and Susan turned their heads. They looked past the federal agents. They looked past their handcuffed, weeping son. They locked their eyes entirely on me. Sheer, unadulterated terror radiated from their gaze. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, shallow breathing of the two people who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible. The lead detective did not blink. He stepped closer to David, his imposing frame blocking out the afternoon light pouring through the glass walls. "I asked you a question," the detective said, his voice vibrating with authority. "Did you knowingly conspire with Julian Thorne to launder embezzled corporate funds through your personal accounts?" Susan let out a high-pitched wail. Her knees buckled and she grabbed the edge of my mahogany desk to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. She did not look at the detective. She did not look at Julian. She stared directly at me, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and overflowing with absolute panic. "Maya, please," Susan begged. The sound was guttural, stripped of every ounce of country club sophistication and maternal superiority she had wielded like a weapon for 30 years. "Tell them we did not know. Please, Maya. You have a whole team of corporate lawyers. You have all this power now. You own the debt. You can make this go away. We are old. We cannot go to federal prison. Please, you are our daughter." I stood perfectly still. The sheer audacity of her plea hung in the air. For 3 decades, being their daughter meant nothing but carrying the weight of their constant disappointment. It meant being shoved into the shadows so Julian could shine. Now, facing the absolute destruction of her freedom, my title as her daughter was suddenly her most valuable asset. David reached out, his trembling hands grasping the air toward me. "Maya," he choked out, his chest heaving. "We just wanted to help him. We did not know the money was stolen from innocent people. He told us it was a bridge loan. We are your parents. You have to save us." I looked at the two people who had happily watched my brother attempt to humiliate me on Thanksgiving. I looked at the parents who had bankrupted themselves to protect a criminal. "I will not lift a single finger," I said, my voice dropping to a frigid, echoing register, "until you admit exactly what you did. And you are going to admit it, right now, out loud, in front of these federal agents and my chief operating officer." Susan sobbed, shaking her head frantically. "Maya, please, there is no time. Admit it," I commanded, striking the surface of the desk with the flat of my hand. The sharp crack made Julian flinch in his handcuffs. "You spent my entire life punishing me for being responsible. You called me a garbage woman. You told your friends I was a disappointment because I did not have a flashy corner office or a leased sports car. You ignored every single red flag Julian threw in your face because admitting he was a failure meant admitting you failed as parents. Tell the truth, Dad. Did you coddle a criminal?" David swallowed hard. The remaining color drained from his face as he looked at the 3 federal agents recording every word. He looked at Julian, who was currently weeping into his own chest, offering zero defense for the parents who had ruined their lives for him. "We knew he was in trouble," David whispered, his voice cracking. "We knew the returns he promised were impossible, but we could not let him fail. He was our boy. We just looked the other way. We gave him our mortgage money because we thought he could fix it. We punished you because you reminded us of the hard work we did not want to force him to do." "Say it clearly," Zoe interjected from the wall, her eyes narrowed with surgical precision. "Admit what you enabled." "We enabled a thief," Susan sobbed, her face burying into her hands. The pristine facade was completely obliterated. "We enabled him. We turned a blind eye to his lies. We treated you terribly, Maya. We were so wrong. We were just so arrogant, and we sacrificed you to protect him. Please, we are begging you. Do not let them take us away." The pathetic weeping admissions hung heavily in the air. They were completely stripped of their pride, their arrogance, and their delusions of grandeur. They were nothing but 2 terrified, ruined people facing the ultimate consequences of their lifelong favoritism. Julian continued to whimper in the chair, thoroughly abandoned by the parents he had just tried to sell out. I watched them cry for a long, silent moment. I felt no triumph, no joyful vindication. I only felt a cold, clinical closure. The toxic foundation of our family had finally been exposed to the light, and it had instantly crumbled to dust. I turned my attention away from my weeping parents and looked directly at the lead detective. I reached over to the secondary file sitting on the corner of my desk, the one Zoe had meticulously prepared the night before. My parents are absolute fools, officer, I stated calmly, breaking the heavy tension in the room. They are arrogant, narcissistic, and willfully ignorant. But they are not criminal masterminds. I picked up the thick-bound folder and handed it directly to the lead detective. This is a comprehensive forensic audit report conducted by Vanguard Financials and verified by my own internal accounting team, I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. It details every single transaction Julian Thorne made over the last 36 months. This audit explicitly proves that Julian acted entirely alone. He actively falsified documentation to hide the illicit origins of the funds from his parents. He forged bank letterheads to convince them his returns were legitimate. They gave him their mortgage money willingly, but they did so under the false pretenses he manufactured. They are guilty of catastrophic financial stupidity, but they are not co-conspirators in his embezzlement scheme. The detective opened the folder, his eyes scanning the verified digital trails, the IP address logs, and the forged documents Julian had presented to David and Susan. He flipped through the pages for several tense minutes while Julian let out a low, defeated groan. The audit was ironclad. Julian's attempt to drag his parents down with him had been instantly neutralized by the very sister he had spent his life mocking. The detective closed the folder and nodded slowly. He looked at David and Susan with a mixture of professional acknowledgement and deep personal pity. "Consider yourselves extremely lucky you have a daughter who knows how to run a forensic audit," the detective said coldly. He turned his attention back to Julian, grabbing him by the arm. "Let us go, Thorne. You have a lot of explaining to do downtown." The three detectives hauled Julian out of the office. He did not look back. He did not apologize. He simply vanished through the glass doors, taking the remaining fragments of my parents' delusions with him. David and Susan slumped against the wall, hyperventilating with sheer dizzying relief. They had been saved from federal prison. They were not going to be wearing handcuffs. They looked up at me, fresh tears of gratitude welling in their eyes. Susan took a hesitant step forward, reaching her hand out toward me. "Yeah." Susan breathed, a tentative, hopeful smile trembling on her lips. "You saved us. Thank you. Thank you so much. We can start over. We can fix this." I pulled my hand back, refusing to let her touch me. The warmth completely vanished from my face. I had saved them from federal prosecution, but I had not forgiven them. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single stark white document. I did not hand it to my father. I stepped forward and pressed it firmly into my mother's outstretched hand. "I saved you from a federal indictment, Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "But you still have exactly 48 hours to get out of my house." I stepped back, leaving them staring down at the formal eviction mandate in absolute horrified silence. I stepped back, leaving them staring down at the formal eviction mandate in absolute horrified silence. The thick, stark white paper trembled violently in Susan's hands. The bold black ink of the legal header seemed to burn itself directly into her retinas. Notice to vacate. The sheer, undeniable reality of those printed words began to dismantle the very last remaining pillars of her fabricated, affluent reality. Down the long, polished corridor outside my executive suite, Julian's voice echoed. It was a raw, guttural sound, entirely stripped of his expensive education, his tailored suits, and his arrogant swagger. "Mom," he screamed, the sound muffled by the thick glass walls, but unmistakable in its sheer primal panic. "Dad, do not let them take me. Call someone, please." David flinched violently at the sound of his golden boy begging, his shoulders hitching upward, as if anticipating a physical blow. He turned his head toward the door, his parental instincts warring with his complete, devastating lack of power. For 30 years, his entire identity had been built around fixing Julian's mistakes, sweeping his profound failures under the rug, and projecting an image of absolute, untouchable success to their country club friends. Now he was rooted to the spot, listening to his legacy being dragged by federal agents into a transport vehicle. The screaming faded as the elevator doors down the hall finally closed, severing the Thorne family's golden child from their lives. The silence that rushed back into my office was heavy and suffocating. David slowly turned his gaze back to me. The fight had completely drained out of his eyes, leaving only a hollow, terrifying realization of his new, impoverished reality. He looked down at the paper his wife was clutching against her chest. "Maya, you cannot do this," David rasped, his voice sounding incredibly thin and ragged. "We have nowhere else to go. You know the federal authorities froze our primary accounts. You know the bank seized the secondary properties to cover his margin calls. The estate is everything we have left in the world. It is the house you grew up in." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life measuring my worth against my brother's non-existent achievements. I remembered the day I asked him to co-sign a modest low-interest loan to help launch my interior design firm, and how he had laughed, calling it a cute little hobby, before turning around and leveraging their home equity to fund Julian's offshore shell company. "I saved you from a prison cell today, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a frigid, echoing calm. "I handed the detectives the definitive proof that you were merely willfully ignorant rather than actively complicit in his embezzlement. I kept you out of federal custody. But I am not saving you from the consequences of your own financial choices. You made a bad investment. Now you are bankrupt." Susan let out a breathless, agonizing sob, her pristine, carefully curated image completely shattered. Her designer clothing suddenly looked absurd and oversized on a woman who was officially destitute. "You have 30 days to vacate my property?" I continued, enunciating every single syllable with absolute uncompromising clarity. "The estate belongs to TerraCycle now. It is a liquidated corporate asset. You will pack your personal belongings, and you will surrender the keys to my security team on the 30th day. If you remain on the premises on day 31, you will be physically removed for trespassing." Susan dropped the paper. It fluttered to the hardwood floor, landing softly between my polished shoes and her trembling knees. She lunged forward, closing the distance and reaching out to grab my hands. Her fingers were ice-cold, gripping my wrists with a frantic, desperate strength. "Maya, please." Susan pleaded, tears carving deep, dark tracks through her expensive makeup. "We were wrong. We were so blinded by Julian. We see that now. We see everything clearly. You are the strong one. You are the successful one. We can fix this relationship. Give us a second chance." She pulled my hands closer to her chest, her eyes wide and pleading, trying to summon the maternal warmth she had deliberately withheld from me for 3 decades. "We do not need the big estate. We can move into one of your smaller properties. We can be a real family now, just the 3 of us. No more Julian, no more drama. We can start over. Please, Maya, you are our daughter. You have to help us." I stared down at her hands gripping my wrists. I waited to feel a spark of sympathy, a lingering childhood desire for her approval, or a desperate yearning for her affection. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation that would have devastated me a decade ago now felt entirely hollow and pathetic. I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands out of her grasp. I took a measured step backward, putting physical distance between myself and the woman who had happily discarded me whenever it suited her narrative. "A real family makes space for you at the table, Mom," I said, my words slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. "A real family does not sacrifice one child to shield another from his own calculated crimes. A real family does not require a federal indictment and complete bankruptcy to suddenly realize their daughter has value." Susan's breath hitched in her throat. She opened her mouth to argue, to plead, to spin another web of excuses, but the words died before they could be formed. She looked at my face and finally realized the absolute terrifying truth. I was not angry. I was not seeking revenge. I was simply done. "You made your choice a long time ago," I stated softly. "You chose your golden child. Now you get to live with the inheritance he left you." I turned my back on them and walked toward my desk. Zoe was standing by the glass panels, her arms crossed, watching the final dissolution of the Thorne dynasty with quiet, profound satisfaction. She did not need to say a single word. The battle was over. The war was decisively won. I looked up at Marcus, my head of security who had been standing silently by the entrance throughout the entire ordeal. I gave him a single subtle nod. Marcus stepped forward immediately, signaling to the two large security guards waiting in the outer reception area. They moved into the office smoothly, their sheer physical presence demanding immediate compliance. "It is time to leave," Marcus said, his voice perfectly polite, but leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or delay. He gestured toward the open doors. David looked at me one last time. His mouth trembled, but he had no defenses left to mount, no authority left to project, and no leverage left to pull. He placed a shaking hand on Susan's shoulder, guiding his weeping wife toward the exit. They looked like two strangers, aged and hollowed out by the sheer magnitude of their own arrogance. They walked out of the executive suite, their footsteps slow and dragging across the carpet. Marcus followed closely behind them, stepping out into the hallway and pulling the heavy glass doors shut. The thick glass clicked perfectly into the frame, sealing the room. The heavy office doors closed on their sobbing faces, cutting off the noise of the past forever. The silence that rushed into the executive suite after the heavy glass doors clicked shut was absolute. It was not the suffocating, tense quiet that usually preceded one of my father's explosive tantrums, nor was it the icy, calculated stillness my mother used to register her disappointment. It was the sound of a vacuum being broken. The toxic pressure that had weighed on my chest for 30 years simply evaporated. I stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system, and felt the last remaining spikes of adrenaline slowly bleed out of my veins. The war was officially over. 7 days later, that clinical, sterile corporate battlefield felt like a lifetime away. The crisp November air carried the rich, smoky scent of roasted turkey and burning cedar. I stepped out onto the expansive, reclaimed wood patio of my home, balancing a heavy tray of roasted root vegetables. There were no marble columns here, no sweeping, pretentious driveways designed to intimidate guests, and absolutely no silver Mercedes parked out front. My property was nestled deep in the surrounding forest, powered entirely by a discrete solar grid built from sustainable materials and designed to blend seamlessly into the natural landscape. It was a fortress of my own making, and today it was filled with the only people who actually mattered. Loud booming laughter erupted from the fire pit area. I turned my head and smiled. Zoe was leaning back in a deep Adirondack chair, a bright orange beanie pulled over her ears, holding a perfectly toasted marshmallow on a stick. She was in the middle of an animated debate with Hector, my lead site foreman. Hector was a massive man with hands like leather and a laugh that could shake leaves off the trees. He was currently wearing a faded flannel shirt and scuffed work boots, gesturing wildly with a plastic cup of cider. Beside him sat Maria, my chief logistics manager, and David the mechanic who used to keep my single beat-up trash-hauling truck running on sheer willpower and duct tape during my first year in business. These were not investment bankers. They did not wear bespoke Italian suits or carry designer briefcases. They did not care about the Thorne family legacy, the country club hierarchy, or the vicious invisible scorecards my parents used to measure human worth. They were the people who had stood shoulder to shoulder with me in the freezing rain at 5 in the morning, hauling debris out of condemned buildings. They were the ones who had shared lukewarm coffee from a thermos while reviewing site blueprints on the hood of a rusty truck. They had seen me at my absolute lowest, covered in dirt and exhaustion, and they had respected me anyway. I set the tray down on the long, rustic dining table. The spread was a chaotic, beautiful mess. There was no fine china, no crystal goblets, and no seating chart strategically designed to place the most successful family members at the head of the table. We had mismatched ceramic plates, a massive pot of homemade stuffing, and a turkey that Hector had insisted on deep frying in the driveway. It was our delayed Friendsgiving, a tradition we had started years ago when I first walked away from my parents' house and realized I had nowhere to go for the holidays. Zoe caught my eye across the yard. She abandoned her debate with Hector, popped the toasted marshmallow into her mouth, and jogged up the wooden steps to the patio. She bumped her shoulder affectionately against mine, reaching out to steal a roasted carrot from the tray I had just set down. "You know," Zoe mumbled, chewing happily, "I think Hector is actually going to successfully deep fry that second turkey without burning the forest down. I am genuinely impressed." I laughed, a real unforced sound that felt incredibly light in my chest. He promised he watched a tutorial online. I trust him with millions of dollars in heavy machinery, so I suppose I can trust him with poultry. Zoe swallowed and looked at me, her sharp eyes softening. She leaned against the wooden railing, looking out over the crowded, noisy backyard. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the gathering. "How are you feeling, Boss?" Zoe asked quietly, dropping the playful banter for a moment. "Really? It has been a massive week." I followed her gaze. I watched Maria chasing her two young toddlers across the grass. I watched my site managers arguing good-naturedly over a game of cornhole. I thought about the heavy, suffocating Thanksgivings of my past. I remembered the bitter, sharp remarks my mother would make about my weight or my clothes. I remembered sitting in rigid silence while Julian bragged about his fraudulent bonuses, watching my parents gaze at him with absolute adoration while I was pushed to the very edge of the table, invisible and unwanted. I thought about the empty, silent house my parents were currently packing up, facing the crushing reality of their own arrogance. I thought about Julian sitting in a federal holding cell entirely stripped of his golden armor. "I feel exactly right," I answered, turning to look at Zoe. "For the first time in my life, I am not bracing for an impact. I am not waiting for the other shoe to drop. The dead branches have been cut away. The tree can finally grow." Zoe smiled, a slow, genuine expression of profound understanding. She reached over to the rustic beverage station, grabbed 2 glass mugs, and filled them to the brim with warm, spiced apple cider. She handed one to me and raised her own. "Then we should probably make it official," Zoe said, nodding toward the crowd. I took the warm mug, the heat seeping comfortably into my palms. I stepped forward, moving to the head of the long dining table. I tapped my spoon against the thick glass. The sharp, clear ringing cut through the chatter. Slowly, the loud conversations faded. Hector paused his supervision of the deep fryer. Maria gathered her kids. The site managers, the mechanics, the logistics team all turned their attention toward the patio. Dozens of faces looked up at me, their expressions open, warm, and entirely genuine. I looked around at the faces of the people who had built TerraCycle with me. They were the foundation of my success, the safety net that had caught me when my own blood had thrown me away. "We have had an incredible year." I began, my voice carrying clearly across the crisp autumn air. "We have broken records, acquired new territories, and secured the future of this company for decades to come. But standing here looking at all of you, the profits are the least impressive part of what we have built." I stepped down off the patio, joining them on the grass. I walked toward the center of the group, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of the earth beneath my feet. "When I started this journey, I was told that I was a disappointment," I said, maintaining steady eye contact with the people who knew exactly how hard I had fought. "I was told that success was something you were handed, something you inherited by simply being born into the right position. You all taught me the truth. You taught me that respect is earned in the dirt. You taught me that loyalty is not demanded, it is demonstrated." I raised my glass of cider high into the air. The golden liquid caught the fading sunlight, glowing brilliantly against the darkening tree line. "Here is to the family you do not inherit," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, unbothered peace. "Here is to the family you choose. A toast to building your own empire with the people who helped you pour the concrete." Hector raised his plastic cup with a massive grin. To the boss, he roared, his voice echoing through the trees. To Maya, the crowd echoed back a chorus of genuine, fierce loyalty. I clinked my glass against Zoe's, taking a slow, deep sip of the warm cider. The sweet, spiced flavor coated my tongue. I looked around the backyard, listening to the music starting back up, the laughter, resuming the completely unguarded joy of a life entirely under my own control. There were no ghosts left to haunt me. There were no shadows left to hide in. I had walked through the fire and I had built a paradise from the ashes. One of the most powerful lessons from Maya's story is that blood does not obligate you to endure toxic abuse. For years, Maya's parents weaponized their familial bond to protect a golden child, demanding blind loyalty while offering none in return. By saving them from prison, but immediately serving them an eviction notice, Maya perfectly demonstrates the necessary balance between basic morality and strict self-preservation. Forgiveness does not require you to keep harmful people in your life, and setting ironclad boundaries is the ultimate act of self-respect. Have you ever had to draw a difficult line with toxic relatives? Share your experiences in the comments below.